Mr. President, yesterday evening, Iran launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles against military bases in Iraq which house U.S. troops. After General Qasem Soleimani was killed in a targeted drone strike late last week in an act of self-defense and to deter further aggression against America and our allies, our forces were on high alert for an Iranian attack. President Trump and our military leaders emphasized that we would be prepared for whatever response Iran chose to deliver, and by all accounts, we were. Well, if the present circumstances hold, it appears that no U.S. service members were harmed during this attack last night by Iran, which is the best outcome we could have hoped for. In addition, I'm glad no Iraqi troops appear to have been injured or killed in this strike as well. While the result of this provocation by Iran could have been a lot worse, it does not diminish the fact that the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism has a sophisticated and capable ballistic missile program. We know that those capabilities only accelerated under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the so-called nuclear deal during the previous administration, as has the regime's pursuit of their nuclear aspirations. I'm confident that this administration's maximum pressure campaign, combined with our unparalleled military capabilities, as well as the President's decisive actions that have culminated in the airstrike last week, have prevented a much worse outcome from this Iraq by Iran. Last week, I had the opportunity to visit Strategic Command, STRATCOM, in Omaha, Nebraska, where their motto is strategic deterrence. I think that's an important goal to keep in mind. That is, having the means and capabilities not only of hitting back, but a message of deterrence to our adversaries to dissuade them from initiating hostilities in the first place. President Ronald Reagan had his own notion of strategic deterrence. He called it peace through strength. That is something that I believe the President's actions last week have begun to restore. No less a luminary than former General David Petraeus said after the Soleimani attack that perhaps, just perhaps, this would reestablish deterrence. And indeed, based on the response by the Iranian regime last night, where they obviously targeted uninhabited areas where they wanted to save face by showing that they were doing something to retaliate but not wanting to escalate, I think that General Petraeus is right on, that what has happened to this point is reestablishing some level of deterrence. I applaud the President for speaking this morning to the American people and making it clear that under his watch, Iran will never, ever have a nuclear weapon. This, in my view, is the single most important policy objective for the United States and our allies in the Middle East. Deterrence through strength combined with additional economic sanctions are designed to encourage and persuade the Iranian regime to rejoin the community of nations, which will help pave the way for a better way of life for the Iranian people, and to give up these tools of terror which have characterized the Iranian regime since 1979, since the revolution, exporting that terror to other countries, and there was no one more responsible for doing that than General Soleimani, who was taken out in an airstrike last week. As we move forward, the United States and our allies can't turn back. We can't relieve this maximum pressure campaign, and we also must remain cognizant of the dangers of creating power vacuums in the Middle East. Mr. President, the Senate's not in order.
Senate will be in order.
Mr. President, I also hope that our allies in Germany and France and the United Kingdom will work with us to persuade the UN to invoke the snapback provisions under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action to restore international sanctions and restrictions on the Iranian regime to further persuade them to join us in negotiations which will lead to a better outcome for all. It would be helpful if our friends and allies in the UK and France and Germany would join us in that effort. While the United States has not purposely sought out further conflict that would lead to an unnecessary loss of life, we need to defend. We must always defend American personnel and our interests in the Middle East. As the President's pointed out this morning, one of the things that historically has given presidents like Jimmy Carter the determination to declare the blocking of the Strait of Hormuz as an act of war during his administration was our overdependence on energy from the Middle East. As the President pointed out this morning, thanks to the creativity and innovation in places like Oklahoma and Texas, North Dakota, and elsewhere, we now are largely energy independent and self-sufficient. And now we can use this as a tool to engage other countries that are completely dependent on countries like Russia and Iran and others in the Middle East for their energy needs. So this is changing the geopolitics of the world. This is not just the President taking a decisive action against the leading master of terrorism in the Middle East. The geopolitics of the world have shifted, and I hope we will all work together to take advantage of that. As I said, I appreciate the President's courage and leadership. This must have been no easy decision, to be sure. I continue to be proud of our military leadership and the rank-and-file service members who work so hard to protect the United States and our national interests in the Middle East and around the world. Mr. President, on another matter, I spoke last week on the Senate floor about some of the great things that have been accomplished this last year for our country, including my home state of Texas. I pointed out that we notched a number of wins for the American military, as well as our veterans. We sent much-needed assistance to communities devastated by natural disaster, by Hurricane Harvey and others. We confirmed more qualified judges to the federal bench. We invested heavily in securing America's elections from the sort of interference that we saw occur in the last presidential election. And I'm proud to say we strengthened our fight to end the rape kit backlog. We made strides, big and small, to improve the lives of the American people, and I'm eager to add more wins to that list this year. Unfortunately, Congress is starting this year in a rather inauspicious way, not designed to regain the confidence of the American people and our ability to do what benefits them as opposed to satisfying some partisan political interest. High on that list of pretty embarrassing developments is the articles of impeachment that the House has passed. But Speaker Pelosi, now 3 weeks after the House said this urgent matter must be pushed through to protect the country and defend the Constitution, she's still refusing to send those articles of impeachment to the Senate, and we're waiting. Now, I'd be happy if she never sent the articles of impeachment here and realized the error of the House's ways, but I don't expect that to happen. In the meantime, we're going to continue to confirm well-qualified nominees as we are today, and hopefully we'll be able to do work on the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement, which, as the presiding officer knows, we voted out of the Senate Finance Committee yesterday, but which has to clear 6 other committees before it's ready for floor action. Hopefully, we'll be able to get that done sooner rather than later. But with an impending impeachment consuming most of the oxygen here in Washington, there's not a lot of opportunity, let alone political will, to get actual legislating done. There is a laundry list of bills that we could add to our accomplishments in 2020, but there is an opportunity cost when we're squandering our time on this ill-considered impeachment mania. The time and effort we're spending on that could well be used to pass these other pieces of legislation. And so these pieces of legislation wait in impeachment purgatory. On the top of my list this year is legislation to bring down health care costs for the American people, particularly out-of-pocket costs for prescription drugs, something that I thought was a high priority for members on both sides of the aisle as well as the White House. Over the summer, the Senate Judiciary, Finance, and Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committees passed bipartisan bills which deal with everything from high prescription drug prices to surprise medical billing. While we knew there was still additional work that needed to be done, everyone was somewhat optimistic that we could pass some combination of these bills by the end of last year. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. Negotiations are continuing, but I had hoped we could make progress on some non-controversial bills in the meantime, like the one that I introduced to stop drug makers from gaming the patent system. I just read this morning that Humira, the manufacturer of Humira, which is an incredible drug, but the most widely prescribed drug in America, they're raising their list price by 7%. This is a drug that has generic competitors overseas, but are not approved here in the United States because Humira has gamed the patent system by acquiring more than 120 different patents on this drug, the same one that's being sold cheaper and more widely available in Europe. The bill that we introduced that I introduced with Senator Blumenthal, the senator from Connecticut, to deal with that was called the Affordable Prescriptions for Patients Act. And it strikes a delicate balance of protecting innovation while increasing competition. And it would be a win for every American who has felt the sticker shock at the pharmacy. This bill is a modest bill, but it represents real progress. Bipartisan support, check that box. I introduced the bill with Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, as I mentioned, and I'm proud to have the support of the minority whip, as well as the ranking member of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, and this passed out of the Senate Judiciary Committee unanimously. Well, does it increase the deficit? No, it actually helps the deficit, so we can check that box. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the bill would save the government more than $500 million over the next decade, not to mention what it might do to private insurance costs. During simpler times, this bill would have been quickly approved by the Senate and sent to the House for their consideration and the President's signature. But if we've learned anything this last few years, it's that nothing is simple here in Congress or in Washington. So after waiting for months, I came to the Senate floor to ask that the bill be passed. After all, it sailed through the process, and I hadn't heard a single senator with any substantive objection to the bill. But that's when the Democratic leader, the senator from New York, came down here to block it. And he did it not once, but twice. He didn't object on substance. In fact, he admitted it was a good bill. As I said, it checks every box when it comes to good legislation, so it certainly wasn't because it fell short there. The only reason the Democratic leader objected to this legislation on two separate occasions is because of politics. He's chosen to participate in political games with a bill that's non-controversial and straightforward, which would stop Big Pharma from abusing the patent system to increase their profits and increase prices to consumers. At a time when he views his most critical priority as the minority leader in opposing the president, and in turn, Senate Republicans, he couldn't stand to see a bill introduced by a Republican actually advance and become law. I'm sure his constituents in New York can't be too happy about that because they're paying the high price of patent gamesmanship too. And you can guarantee, I can guarantee you that Big Pharma is rejoicing over his obstruction. Well, as I said, just this last week, big drug companies have already begun to announce their price increases. According to their analysis, 445 different drugs have had their prices raised already by an average of 5%, and we're only 1 week into the new year. It's particularly maddening that even consensus legislation is getting caught up in this hyper-partisan environment. But I'm hoping that once this looming impeachment trial is behind us, we can find our way to work together and make some progress. Another bill that I'm anxious to see passed this year is a reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which again has gotten caught up in partisan gamesmanship. Last year, the House passed an ultra-partisan bill which both parties knew would be dead on arrival in the Senate. Our friends, the House Democrats, chose to include a variety of poison pills in order to prove a point and perhaps gain some political advantage rather than actually get a bill to the president's desk. Well, to their credit, that's where Senator Feinstein, the senator from California, and Senator Ernst, the senator from Iowa, to their credit, they tried long and hard to try to come up with a bill that we could take up here on the Senate floor. But all of a sudden, late in the game, our friends across the aisle walked away from the negotiating table and chose to introduce a near replica of the House's partisan piece of legislation. Unfortunately, they succumbed to the politics of the moment rather than solving the problem that would actually help support victims of violence and reauthorize that legislation. Despite our Democratic colleagues leaving those negotiations, though, our colleague from Iowa, Senator Ernst, continued to work in good faith on a bill to reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act, and I'm proud to be a co-sponsor. I would urge the Majority Leader to put that piece of legislation on the floor and to do it at the earliest possible moment so we could have a vote, we could have a debate, we could offer amendments, but we could actually get the job done rather than continuing to use this as a political football. It sends more funding and resources than the bill that the Democrats have proposed, and it authorizes a program twice as long. It is not just an alternative, it's a better choice for victims of sexual assault and violence. It includes a whole lot more than funding, though. It addresses a number of horrific crimes that are being committed against women and girls around the country, which are not included in our Democrat colleagues' version. I regret that we were unable to pass a reauthorization for the Violence Against Women Act, and I hope our colleagues across the aisle will reconsider and come back to the negotiating table and work with us so we can finally reauthorize this program. And finally, Mr. President, another priority that I alluded to a moment ago that I hope we can get to soon is pass the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Trade Agreement, which will succeed NAFTA and guide our trading relationships with Mexico and Canada in the future. NAFTA has been a boon for our economy, especially in my state, in Texas, but it's time to bring this more than quarter-century-old agreement into the 21st century, and that's precisely what the USMCA will do. It modernizes trade with our northern and southern neighbors and lays the foundation for better economies, more jobs, and greater prosperity for each of our countries. The process of getting that bill across the Senate floor has been more than a year in the making, but we are making some progress, as I indicated, starting yesterday in the Senate Finance Committee. It was reported out with a bipartisan vote, 25 for and 3 against. I haven't been shy about expressing my concerns about how this process has played out, especially cutting the Senate out of the its negotiating position under Trade Promotion Authority. But I do believe on net that this agreement is beneficial, and so I will support it. So I look forward to getting an opportunity, presumably once Speaker Pelosi sends the articles of impeachment over here and it meets its expected fate. Nobody I know expects 67 senators to vote to convict and to remove President Trump based on the thin gruel presented by the 2 articles of impeachment that were voted on by the House in an ultra-partisan manner. But I hope we can, once we get past all of that, I hope we can continue along a series of wins for our country in 2020, and I, for one, am eager to work on that. I hope we'll be able to chart a path forward on an impeachment trial in the near future so that we can begin focusing on this legislation that will help the American people over the next 12 months and not squander a minute more than absolutely necessary. President, I yield the floor.